Tonight's panel discussion promises to be engaging and perhaps even controversial. And we have three of our very successful alumni with us to take us on that journey. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Julian Savulescu, Professor Gab Kovacs, and Associate Professor Nicholas Tonti Filippini. Professor Savulescu is a world-leading ethics scholar. He holds the Uhiro Chair in Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford and is a Sir Louis Matheson Distinguished Visiting Professor at Monash University. Professor Savulescu is also one of Monash's distinguished alumni. A researcher, educator and communicator, Professor Savulescu promotes public discussion around the ethical issues of everyday life. Professor Kovacs is a Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Monash University and a subspecialist in reproductive gynecology. He's been a staff member at Monash IVF since 1978. He's been President of the Fertility Society of Australia, Family Planning Australia, Family Planning Victoria, and Chairman of the IVF Directors Group of Australia. Associate Professor Tonti Filippini is the Associate Dean for Teaching, Learning and Research and Head of Bioethics at John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family, and also a consultant in bioethics. He was Australia's first hospital ethicist, holding that position at St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne, from 1982 to 1990, where he was also founding director of the Bioethics Department. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Monash University lecturer and well-known media commentator Waleed Aly. Waleed, stop. Waleed lectures in politics at Monash and works within the university's Global Terrorism Research Centre. He appears regularly in the media, including hosting ABC Radio 774 shows, ABC TV's Big Ideas, and SBS TV's The Late Sessions. He's previously worked as a commercial lawyer and was a board member of the Islamic Council of Victoria for more than 4 years. Now, so please join me in welcoming Mr. Waleed Aly and our panellists, Professor Julian Savulescu, Professor Gab Kovacs, and Associate Professor Nicholas Tonti Filippini as they discuss artificial life and designer babies and what this means for the future.
Thanks for that introduction, and this is off to a great start. We've got lots and lots of applause and we haven't done anything, so this is fabulous. I was just thinking about the topic for tonight, and there's so many strands that it can go in. My first thought was that plenty of people actually throughout history have attempted to create the master race. Usually they've done that by trying to eliminate people that they thought got in the way of realising that goal. But what if technology gives us the means to do something similar? Does that change the ethical questions that are at play? Does it mean that it's something that we should pursue, given that we can do it through technological means, or is it something that really is best left untouched, that we're perhaps meddling with something that we don't understand? Is this a form of, an extreme form, I suppose, of social engineering, or are there public benefits that we should be thinking about and pursuing? Who would make these sorts of decisions? Would parents make decisions about the perfect children that they're going to bring into the world? If so, what's the basis of their right to make that choice? Is it essentially a consumerist decision? We get to make choices about the cars that we buy, why not the children that we have? Or are there broader social questions at play as well? Is there a social benefit in giving people that choice? Kids can't choose their parents. Why should parents be able to choose their kids? And then, of course, there are the health dimensions to this area. Is it okay to do things that would result in the termination of fetuses, for instance, if it results in advances in medical research, in health research? What about creating people, having children, for the same reason? Does that raise a different set of questions, or is it essentially the same thing? If you're for one, do you have to be for the other? And the same with being against them. These are all questions I can't answer. So you're lucky that I'm not going to. Instead, we have a group of people who can, and answer them in very different ways, but all in very enlightening ways. I'm going to start by asking the first question, because that's what I get to do. And Julian, I'm going to direct it to you, if that's okay. Take us through this concept that you talk about of proactive beneficence. Congratulations on a great nugget of language, but what does it mean?
Well, it's such a great nugget of language that it's very immemorable, because it's actually procreative beneficence.
Right.
It's the idea that we have an obligation in procreation to bring about the best children that we can have. The basis of it is that nature has no mind to equality, no mind to health, no mind to happiness in terms of the children that it produces, the embryos and fetuses. There are huge disparities in terms of the diseases that children are born with, how healthy they are, but also in terms of their gifts or talents, or even their basic abilities to control their impulses, to be able to attend and concentrate enough at school, to be able to learn enough to be able to participate in society. So what modern genetics and modern science and the sort of stuff that Gab Kovacs is doing enables us to do now is to create a range of embryos and to test the biology of those embryos and gain some information about how likely they are to develop certain diseases. But very soon it will give us information about the kinds of dispositions, personality, characteristics, abilities, disabilities, gifts, talents, and so on. And the idea is that we should use that knowledge to select from a range of children that we could have, the children who are going to have the healthiest lives, or predicted to have the healthiest lives, and those that start off life with advantages rather than disadvantages. So, if you like, it's to correct the unfairness of the natural lottery. So the idea is not only should people be permitted to use genetics and our knowledge of biology to choose the kinds of children that they have, they actually should, insofar as they can use this technology without significant cost to themselves or society, use it to try to have children who are healthy, but also have the best chance of the best life.
There's a lot embedded in what you've just said, though. I'm just listening to what you're saying. Phrases like the best life, advantages. On what basis do we make those decisions? I, for instance, happen to be quite fond of the fact that I have eyesight. Someone who has never had eyesight may feel differently about that. They have a different social experience. So they may not feel differently, but they may. The point is that these are decisions that, although we often mask the fact, have subjectivity to them. So to what extent is it really appropriate for us to be imposing our subjectivity on this range of things and calling it an objective good?
Well, of course, people have disagreements about what a good life is, and we all have different ideas for our own life, and there's lots of areas you can't make clear decisions about what's better. But there are some areas where you can. Some of you might have heard in my favourite example, but there's one aspect of people which all of you will have, because you're here sitting and listening to a fairly longish debate, but you have an element of self-control and impulse control. And there was a famous experiment where a guy called Walter Mischel put 4-year-old children in front of a marshmallow and told them not to eat the marshmallow. And when he came back, some of them had eaten it and some of them hadn't. Some of them had delayed gratification, controlled their impulses. Now, when he followed those children up 10 years later, those children who were able to control their impulses, delay their gratification, had more friends, more motivation to succeed, and much better academic performance. And when you follow these people through life, they have enter a much higher socioeconomic level, and they don't end up in prison. If you have poor impulse control, you're highly likely to end up at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale and in prison. Now, impulse control is not something that determines what we do in life. It's something that is useful no matter what you want to do. If you want to be a basketballer or a priest or a footballer or a doctor, being able to apply yourself long enough to achieve what you want to achieve is a basic talent, a basic advantage. And there are some things like that that are beneficial no matter what sort of life you want to lead. Now, I would take issue with you that blindness and deafness aren't actually disabilities, even if people claim that they are.
Are you accusing them of false consciousness if they happen to disagree with you?
Well, I mean, think about the range of impediments that you face in the way the world is today, okay? If you're deaf, I mean, you can't hear alarms, you can't hear music, you can't hear various stimuli and engage in the world in a certain way. Now, if you are deaf, what's the advantage of being deaf? Well, you can sign and you can be a part of a deaf community, but of course, if you're hearing, you can learn to sign and also be a part of a deaf community. You can communicate, you can be... So it's like speaking two languages. So there isn't a good reason to claim, well, you know, if my child goes deaf, I don't have to correct it because there's just a disagreement about the value of deafness. If you had a child and the child developed an infection that was going to render the child deaf and you refused to give the child antibiotics, I think you should be taken to court and the court would authorise the treatment. Because we don't, as a society, have complete relativism about what's a good life. That's how we design our education systems, that's how we design our social programs, that's how we try to bring up our children.
Can I come in on this?
Yeah, sure.
I'm a little surprised. I thought tonight, because I'd be talking about reproductive discrimination and some of the issues there, I thought that tonight, I would be defending a more restricted position against a more liberal position. I'm surprised because what Julian has outlined, the idea of an obligation to produce the best children, sounds to me as though this is Big Brother imposing on our community an obligation not to have children with disabilities. It seems to me that what's happened here is a kind of reversal of what I expected, in that I'm going to try and defend liberty, the freedom of people to form their families and to form their families with disabilities, to defend a community that has people with disabilities, to defend the status of people who have disabilities.
You're running two issues together. I didn't say they shouldn't be free. And in fact, I defended people's freedom.
The obligation to produce the best children.
Sorry, there's a difference between what people should do. You should give up smoking. Should you be compelled to give up smoking? No, you should be free to smoke if you want. They're two separate issues. What the goals of a morality should be, and I'm happy to stand up and say, I think we should have children who have the best prospects of the best life. You should be free to have any sort of children you want. I mean, you should be free to deliberately select a deaf child if you're a deaf couple and you want to have a deaf child.
But you want to say they've got an obligation not to have children with disabilities?
No, I'm saying that's what they should do. Obligation here means it's like saying you've got an obligation to look after your health and give up smoking. Now, I think we can have this kind of discourse without imposing on people restrictions of their freedom. In fact, I'm the one that's defended procreative liberty or procreative freedom, the freedom to...
Well, more than that, beneficence.
Well, so what I'm arguing here is that you should have some account of the good to guide those decisions, but at the end of the day, we live in a liberal society and people should be free to decide how many children they have, when they have children, and what kind of children they have.
When you put up the word obligation in a society, obligation and the language of obligation doesn't come without weight. It doesn't come without saying, I think you're doing the wrong thing if you have a child with disabilities.
Well, look, how far your obligations go on how we should discuss people's obligations and what they should do are different issues. I mean, I personally don't think you should be criticising other people's lives. Somebody, might make the wrong decision about how they bring up their children. That doesn't mean we have to criticise them. These things are separable. They don't necessarily fall together.
Oh, but come on, Julian, you're making an ethical argument about what people should do and what they shouldn't do. That implies a judgment about what other people are doing. You can't escape that.
No.
Well, we make these kinds of judgments every day when we say, you know, somebody shouldn't have another child because they can't provide enough for their existing children. You know, we make these decisions. How we impose those decisions is a separate question. I've been in print as defending people's procreative liberty, and I sincerely believe that we should respect the rights of people not to use these selection techniques to have children without disabilities. And we should also respect that in the sense that we don't undermine their ability to do it in indirect ways. So, you know, you can have, in this case, your cake and eat it too. You can have freedom, but also have a discussion about what people should or shouldn't be doing.
So you make the argument that, given the choice, the better choice is to use these tools that are available.
Look, you know, if you've got two embryos here, and on the basis of your tests, you know this one, on everything you can tell, is going to have a normal life, and you know that this one is going to have profound deafness, blindness, and intellectual disability. I'm sorry, I just have to say that you've got a reason to choose this one and a reason not to choose that one. You should choose this one. Now, if somebody says, well, you know, I want that one because, you know, I feel, you know, we haven't done enough to, you know, promote people's disabilities in the world, well, so be it.
I want to bring Gab Kovacs on this in a moment, but just one final question. Is there a danger of setting up a false choice here? The comparison between someone who lives, for example, with deafness or without it, whereas for the person concerned, the choice is really living with deafness or not at all. And so isn't that a very different question that we're answering at that point?
I think this is a complicated thing for people to get their minds around. When you're talking about reproduction, you're talking about two individuals, one of whom will exist and one of them won't. So you'll either have a child who will be born hearing, or you'll have a child who will be born deaf, but you can't make the deaf child hearing, and likewise in this case you can't make the hearing child deaf. You're faced with this choice. So the question is, you know, which is it better to bring into the world?
But you only have this choice if people have their children on IVF programs, which at the moment is something like, what, 1%?
3%.
3%, is it?
Babies.
3% of babies.
Yeah.
So it's a small proportion. What you're talking about, this kind of choice, is only available to those people who are on IVF programs. Are you suggesting that...
Gab Kovacs is itching to get in here, so I'll try to...
Well, we're just going to say, let's bring our feet back on the ground. I really am impressed by how much you think we can actually achieve. And what we can actually do is, I don't believe anywhere near what you think we can, and I don't think we'll ever be able to isolate those perfect children. I mean, IVF was developed to help infertile people have children. In fact, it was developed for women who had blocked tubes. That's what we started off doing back in the 1970s. Since then, of course, it's expanded to other sorts of subfertility, like male factor, unexplained subfertility, and we do reasonably well with those couples. But even then, we try really hard. We try and improve the pregnancy rate all the time to do better with those couples. PGD spun off as sort of value added to IVF, where Alan Troughton had this idea that we could take some cells off the embryo and do certain tests. But let's be clear about what PGD does. It really, first of all, it's not a roadworthy on the embryo. We can't take a cell off the embryo and say it's a normal embryo, let alone it's a talented one, which people like us to do, you know, the blue eyes and the good athletic ability. We'll never be able to do that. That's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. And if we do go to PGD to look for something like cystic fibrosis or some other single gene disease, which we try to eliminate from two carriers, it's a difficult, complex process. It significantly increases both the cost and the complexity of IVF, and less than 5% of the people going through IVF actually take part in PGD. And of course, the other thing about it is that even if you do make the diagnosis and you put that embryo back, there's no guarantee it's going to take. It's about a 1 in 3 chance. So I think the first thing we have to do is refocus what technology will be able to do now, or what it can do now, and what it might be able to achieve in the future. And I don't think we'll have the ability to choose the perfect children and use it for eugenics.
Does that, in your mind, then create a different ethical debate? Does it change the ethical questions that we have to grapple with? Or is it, once you boil it down to essential principles, really the same thing, just a matter of degree?
Look, it's really difficult. I guess the ethical debate is, well, we go back one step further in Victoria, because we've got an ethical debate about who may or may not be parents by IVF. You know, the only place in the world where you have to police record check before you can do IVF. You have to go through and be approved to make sure you don't have any history which is not approved of, that you haven't been unkind to children in the past. So we already do ethical screening of who may or may not be parents by IVF, not that we do it for natural parents. And then, of course, if we're going to do any other genetic screening in Victoria, we have to justify it to the, to the patient review committee and people who decide whether it's a reasonable thing to screen for or not. So therefore, I think, what we're talking about the pipe dream, because I'm never going to approve any of those things. We'll never be doing them, and I think we're talking about sort of fantasy land.
But I guess what I'm asking then is, does that mean the argument, for example, that Julian's putting, where people should be making these decisions to try to bring into the world a child that has the greatest advantages, does that argument lose its force because, for example, the knowledge on which it's based is not as solid as we might think?
Well, we don't have to think about IVF. We know that children born to people who've got certain things like they're overweight, who smoke, who have marijuana, have a disadvantage. And we know that mothers dying in pregnancy might affect children. We've got the Baker hypothesis about what happens to you at birth and in utero, and how the child's going to affect you. And do people in the community take any notice? No, they don't. They all smoke, they drink, they're overweight. And, people in the community do not make the best efforts to produce the best and healthiest children they can.
But if I'm overweight and I want to lose weight, that takes a lot of effort. Not the same as ticking a box on a form that says choose this child or that child. And so it's a different sort of circumstance.
But after you've ticked the form, you've got to go through the IVF process, which takes a lot of effort.
I mean, look, we may as well go home. There's no debate to be had, according to your argument, and, so be it. But I frankly find this, I know what you're saying now is focused on the present, and I know you have a business in IVF and reassuring people that everything's fine. But even if there's just one test or a series of tests, and you've got to remember that in 10 years' time you'll be able to analyse presumably the whole genome of an embryo. Now, you may not be able to pick somebody who's going to have a perfect life, but you'll get information about various characteristics besides the disease propensity. Now, I frankly can't believe you that you won't be able to test for eye colour. You could test for the ACE gene that enables you to be an elite mountain climber. I mean, there are genes that are already identified that dispose to certain characteristics in people. Now, I really can't believe that we won't be able to make any decisions that aren't just about disease in 10 years' time. But if we can't, debate's over. We may as well go home.
One of the things that we are debating right now is the question of gender, people choosing gender, which we've got the capacity to do. It's, as I understand it, relatively easy and relatively confident that you can do it. That raises issues for us of what we've used the phrase reproductive discrimination, that is, decisions that are made on grounds that we think they shouldn't be made. And here I'm on the moral side of things. It's interesting I'm quite happy to talk about moral obligations. I know that Julian's uncomfortable about it, but I do think there are issues to be raised about decisions that people make that are discriminatory. And a decision to have a boy or a girl and to use the technology for that purpose does seem to me to raise concerns for the whole community, not just for that individual couple and their child.
You said that you're worried about people undertaking IVF for what you call frivolous reasons.
Well, I've not used that word. But,
well,
yeah.
do you therefore suggest that there are reasons that would be perfectly acceptable, or is that enough for you to say that the whole idea is unacceptable?
I understand the motivations of people who use IVF in order to have children. The desire to have a child is an enormous desire, and it's a way in which people fulfil their lives by being parents and so on. So I understand that motivation. What I'm talking about, I guess, is using that technology developed for that purpose for a discriminatory purpose, to decide what sort of children there should be, which is not what it was designed for. And it's a reason I think that the community needs to look at and decide whether the technology should be used for those reasons. And the community has looked at it, and the legislation here in this state and the national guidelines both prohibit using reproductive technology for the purposes of choosing gender. They do allow the technology to be used to choose against major disabilities, and that's the purpose of the Patient Review Committee, is to to look at the patient review panel, to look at those issues. But there is an argument in the community about whether that's discriminatory, whether, and I take the view that it is. I think it is reproductive discrimination to eliminate embryos because you think that they have disabilities, that is, they have characteristics that you would prefer they didn't have.
It's a really interesting example that you raised, Julian. I wouldn't mind coming back to you on it. Because of your opening remarks about choosing children that have advantages, for instance, over those that have disadvantages, does that change where advantage is socially constructed? Gender being a good example. Plenty of places in the world where it's highly advantageous to be male as opposed to being female. So does your ethical logic lead you to a conclusion that it's perfectly acceptable to selectively bring men or males into the world without necessarily thinking about what that might mean for society in the long run when there are no women left?
Well, another example is often given to me in the US where there's discrimination against African Americans, whether you should prefer to have lighter skinned children rather than darker skinned children so they don't suffer so much disadvantage. So you have to, what's the best way of correcting injustice in society? Well, the best way is to deal with the attitudes and the institutions that cause that injustice. It isn't about interfering in reproduction. It isn't about engineering. Of course, you might think that it's a good way to make a statement, to have a certain kind of child, to try to promote respect for people of a disadvantaged or discriminated class. But I don't think that even in this case it's a reason to prevent people from making choices. If they make choices in those cases to have a white child or make a choice to have a male in a sexist society, that's the symptom of the disease. It's not the disease. The disease is the background set of institutions, attitudes and norms and so on that require changing, not whether we interfere in their reproduction or not.
Sure, but should we be facilitating the symptom, I guess?
Well, again, here you have to ask how far are you facilitating the disease itself by allowing people to make these choices? And I mean, if you look at India, why do people select to have a male in India? Well, one reason is that only males can have religious obligations to the dead and bring, the dead parent into some kind of heaven. You also have to pay an enormous dowry if you have a girl, so it's very expensive to have a girl, and part of it's an economic reason. That's why people choose to have. Partly it's a religious reason, and partly it's an economic reason. That's why they have a strong pressure to have male babies rather than female babies. Now, I think those are sort of crazy institutions, and we should change those. But given that they're there, I don't see why we should interfere in people's choices.
Let's shift it back away from cultures that favour one gender over another, and just look at gender discrimination in reproduction in our society, where we don't have those obvious. At least I don't think we do have those obvious differences. Although I guess you could say that we do still, to some extent, that men still earn more than women on average and those sorts of things. So there is some discrimination left, but generally you wouldn't say that there was a huge advantage either way in being male or female. But it's still an issue when a couple chooses to use this technology, and on that occasion makes a discriminatory choice to say, right now we would prefer to have a girl rather than a boy. And it's offered in terms of family balancing. The idea of we've got two boys already that we want a girl, or vice versa, and rather than continuing to have children trying to get that girl or get that boy, we could do it by go on the IVF program and have PGD. It still seems to me that there's an issue for the community there. Beyond in India and China, we know the balancing has worked out very badly, and we know in some provinces of China there are 138 boys born to every girl born and that sort of thing. But we wouldn't expect that here. So it's not that the economic argument that you're putting or the balance, those sorts of arguments. It's really this individual choice. And I still think that there is a problem with a couple intervening in such a way as to destroy those embryos that of the unchosen gender and favouring those of the other and transferring those, using the technology in that way, does say something that I think is unfortunate.
Would you also disagree with sperm sorting?
Can I finish what I'm saying? The issue here is that you're making parenthood conditional. You're making the entry of a child into life conditional upon whether the child belongs to the gender that the parents want or not. And the view I take is that there shouldn't be any conditions on whether a child is to be born or not. There shouldn't be a kind of sifting out of which children may be allowed to survive and which not. That all children, the whole nature of parenthood, if you think about what happens in parenthood, all of the things that can go wrong, all of the things that turn a perfect infant into a difficult 2-year-old and an even more difficult adolescent, all of those sorts of problems that can develop, parenthood needs to be an accepting sort of thing from the beginning. We need to be able to say that as parents we will accept our children no matter what, and that's been the character of parenthood. That there is a unilateral gift that you make as a parent to accept that child and rear that child and care for that child no matter what. But the whole process of putting them through a technology to choose a child greatly undermines what it means to be a parent and what parental love actually means. Well, it's no longer unconditional.
Where is the evidence for that claim?
I might jump here to Gab Kovacs because I think you've got a lot to say on this issue.
Well, I have. I mean, first of all, I guess I'm in the difficult situation. I've seen several couples who want to come along for gender selection. I don't believe I've seen anyone who's come along saying we're going to have our first child and want that first child to be a boy or girl. So in our community, the problem is basically family balancing. And I was going to ask Nicholas how would he feel. I understand he doesn't like the embryos being discarded. But if we said to couples, OK, you can come along, you can have IVF and PGD, you only want a female child, that's fine, but are you prepared to donate all the other male embryos to some other couples who'd be happy to use them, who can't get pregnant, so those embryos aren't wasted? Would that remove one of your oppositions to gender selection, Nicholas?
Well, my objection is to having all those embryos in the laboratory in the first place, and putting them into that situation where their life is just subject to choice in that way.
But, I mean, that's one way you could look at it. But gender selection is here and it's very real. But again, let's get our feet back on the ground, because I think, obviously, I'm debating with philosophers who talk about ideas. I'm a simple gynaecologist who has problems to solve every day and has to be fairly non-judgmental, because often I sit in my consulting room and I'll see a woman who wants a termination, and I'll see somebody else who's got a fertility problem, someone else who wants to be sterilised. So it's really difficult not to be judgmental, but I have to try and divorce myself and look at the problem of that particular couple. So when the couples come along, and to do PGD, you've got to be dedicated, because rather than getting pregnant at home, you have to go through a whole gamut of IVF, all the things that are involved. The people who are now doing it are going offshore. They have to be prepared to go to Thailand or America, spend a whole lot of money. And again, there's no guarantee it's going to work. So these people are pretty desperate. Now, we've always said, or people who've been controlling reproductive technology said, it should be the best interest of the child. Now, can I put it to you that maybe it's in the best interest of the child to be a boy if that couple really wants a boy, or to be a girl if that couple really wants a girl? Because if they have a child naturally, and it's the opposite sex, the child may not have as good a loving, accepting family, unconditional love.
Yeah, I'm interested in that argument that you make, because it's one that I've heard before. Is there evidence to show that that's the way that parents actually behave once the child's actually born? I mean, you may have hope for a child of a particular sex, but when they're there, do you really see a difference in the attitude of parents?
I don't know. I don't think there would be any evidence, Waleed, but I don't think anyone's looked at those sort of studies. It'd be interesting. I don't know.
I'd like to respond to it.
Sure.
That question that you raise of the couple treating the child badly, I guess, I mean, I don't know that there's any evidence for it, but if that was the case, that would only highlight the point that I'm making, that parenthood ought not be like that. Parenthood ought not be conditional.
I agree with you. We shouldn't let anyone be parents.
I mean, but no. If you think about the issue of gender, if a couple are choosing a child because they want a child of a particular gender, what are they saying about gender that makes it so important? What's the stereotype of gender that's being used there that says that this is so vitally important to have a child of this gender rather than the other gender, that they're actually are going to go through this kind of process in order to achieve it? I mean, that initially, the very fact that they want to go through all of that process to achieve it says something to me that indicates that their attitude to parenthood isn't completely accepting.
I mean, there's a woman who says, I've had 3 boys. I really love my boys and I wouldn't be without them, but I'd really dearly love to have a girl who I can dress in pretty dresses and put pink ribbons on her hair.
And the girl may not want to do all those sorts of things. That's what I'm saying. If there's a stereotype that you've got of what a girl should be, then I pity that girl having to conform to those ideas of what a girl should be.
I guess
can I just say something? There's a parallel debate where we do have some experience, and this is creating so-called saviour siblings, using these technologies to create a child who can give some blood upon being born to save the life of an existing sibling who has no stem cell donor. Now, Nick and other people objected to this with exactly the same claim that parents won't unconditionally love these children, that this is the wrong kind of attitude. You should only have children, on the basis of unconditional love for that child's sake. There's absolutely no evidence to support Nick's claims that these people treat these children adversely when they've been born as saviour siblings.
I'm sorry, there are just so few of them. We've got no evidence.
There is no evidence to support any of your claims about the way people treat children. So you're trying to deny them access to make choices, to infringe their freedom to go and visit Gab and get treatment that they want or interventions they want on the basis of just pure speculation about the quality of their parenting and the way they'll treat their children. And I think that is fundamentally against the principles of a liberal society of intervening in freedom without any evidence of harming anyone.
Well, the issue here is the interests of children and the kinds of...
There's no evidence that children in these circumstances are harmed in any way.
But the burden of proof when it comes to new technologies is in the other direction.
No, sorry.
The burden of proof of a technology like this is to prove its safety.
No, the burden of proof should not be to...
That's the way we operate on all of the new technologies, except this one. If you want to introduce a new drug into the community, if you want to introduce a new kind of farming, if you want to do a different kind of mining, you've got to show that the harm isn't there. You've got to do the assessments.
I'm sorry, the technology is physically safe enough. We know that. What you're speculating is that there will be people who are unfit parents.
No, we don't. If you look at the most recent results for Victoria. For PGD, that is the results published for the year 2009-2010, there was a recorded 80% miscarriage rate following PGD compared to 22% in ordinary IVF.
Well, this is just a tiny sample. Gab Kovacs,
it's a small sample. It's 164 patients.
How safe is PGD in IVF? You're the expert.
Well, it depends on what you mean by safe. I think IVF, 5 million babies now born worldwide. I don't think there's any major abnormalities that would happen that we haven't unearthed. Louise Brown, the world's first,
we're talking about PGD,
We're talking about PGD. Yeah. Well, PGD, again, there is a very good surveillance going on for the European Society of Human Reproduction. They record all the cases. And, unfortunately, I'm too old and senile now to remember figures off the top of my head. But certainly they produce the data each year, and it is published. There's not a significant increase in the abnormality as such.
Can I...
Sorry.
No, go.
And I can't tell you the miscarriage rate off the top of my head. I just haven't got that. But it's still relatively new. There are still not that many people. It's a complex technology. But it's certainly for gender selection, it's readily available. And if it wasn't for the fact that it was illegal, probably some people would choose it. Not many people, but there would be some people who would choose it.
Can I bring the discussion back to the ethical questions? A lot of what's been said here has been about parents' right to choose. For instance, Nicholas, if I may paraphrase you, essentially arguing that this is not the way that we should be thinking of children, of parenthood. Julian, I want to ask you then, the ethical argument that you make, what's the philosophical basis for it? Is it about the rights of the parents as individuals, or are you making a social good argument? Because we haven't really touched on the social good aspects of the discussion so far.
Well, there are two distinct arguments. One is about whether people should be free to access these technologies, and that is just a basic principle of freedom within a liberal society, that you should be free unless you're harming other people. And the mere speculation that you might harm someone is not a reason to infringe people's freedom. So it's a fundamental principle of a liberal society. Nick might have his own views, or other people might have their views on how people should found their families, how many children they should have, whether they should use contraception or not, but those views should not be imposed to restrict freedom. So that's one basic political, philosophical tenet. The second tenet about selecting children is simply a rational principle. If you've got two embryos and you've got information about those, you should use that information to select the best one. That's how you make rational choices. So when you're having children, you're making a choice about, when you have a range of embryos, which of them to bring into existence. So
I understand that, but I guess what I'm asking is, what are the parameters? What's the basis of that choice? When I say this is the better embryo, am I thinking, or would you require us to think socially, or are you thinking individually for that person? So let me give the example of, let's assume we can detect this embryo will be more intelligent than this one. Do I choose the more intelligent embryo because I decide it's better and it's better for that child? Or do I say, well, society needs stupid people in order to function, and therefore I will do my bit for society in making that... Well, what are our horizons? Are they social or are they individual?
Basically, a principle of reproductive decision-making is that there is an obligation to focus on the child's welfare, as Gab Kovacs said. Now, the parameters of that should be if those choices significantly harm other people in society. So if you're making choices that impose direct costs on other people, that would be a reason for intervening. The opposite of that, if making certain choices benefits society, well, that's a reason. If having children that are going to be more productive benefits the economy, well, that's a reason. But should it be imposed on people? No. We should keep the focus of reproductive ethics on the child. So I think the only real way of intervening in parents should be when they're harming somebody, and unfortunately that's not the focus of this debate. It's about certain views about the way parenting should be, or about how society should be constructed, and I think that's very dangerous.
Wouldn't it be consistent with your view to say that when a couple is faced with this choice of embryos, some that are more able than others in different ways, wouldn't you say then, on your view, that it would be harming those children to choose the ones that had the lesser ability?
Well, you're not harming them because that's their only choice of coming into existence. But you're making a choice between different individuals here. I mean, it's important also when people say, well, disability is bad. We all have disabilities now. We'll all find that we have impediments to our lives going as well as they could go. So this idea that disabilities are just things like deafness and blindness is a very mistaken and outdated concept of disability. We all have things, our personality traits, different personality traits make it much more difficult for us in life. We're all disabled to some
extent. Well, we already do this, or a large proportion of the community do this, by the first trimester screening. Now, there are some people who would not want to go ahead and do anything about it, and they don't have it, and no one forced them to have it. But the majority of people who are pregnant want to have first trimester screening to look for chromosomal abnormalities and neural tube defects and things, and they have the choice, and then they have the choice of choosing that pregnancy or not choosing that pregnancy once they made a diagnosis. For the people who are not interested, we don't force them to have this test done, and don't force them then to terminate the pregnancy. So kind of that's what's happening in a practical way today, and what Julian's talking about.
If I can follow it up, there's a culture there, I think, that's worth talking about. I've been doing a fair bit of work lately in this area to see what is happening with couples who have the first trimester screening. We know that about 90% of those couples in this society, if they have a serious abnormality, will abort the child. But we also know, and from figures from the UK and the US, where there's a slightly different set of circumstances, where they are offered what's called perinatal palliative care or perinatal hospice care. And we know that 90% reduces down to 60%. That is, 40% choose the perinatal hospice care. In other words, they choose to continue their pregnancy through to the child being born with a serious abnormality. And it says something, I think, the difference in the figures of 90% to 60% says something about our own Australian culture and what we don't provide. And what we're seeing is accounts of women who are saying, who made the choice after the screening not to have an abortion when they had a child with a serious abnormality. And they talk about the enormous pressures that are applied to them and how difficult it is for them to continue on with those pregnancies in this society, because the medical approach to them is to sort of say, well, you brought this on yourself. This is your problem. You must have known you were going to have to deal with this. And in this community, we don't have the supports We don't have the perinatal hospice services or perinatal care services for people in these circumstances. Now, the point I'm making is that if we move a little bit further down the track, so that we have developed PGD in the way that Julian says we will and Gab says we won't, but if we have developed it down the track like that, will those people also be under those same pressures that women are under right now not to continue their pregnancies?
I'm going to do something very risky, perhaps foolish, given we've only got 10 minutes left. I want to raise the question of the destruction of embryos in the process of scientific research. And Nicholas, I want to come to you on this because I understand your position's against it, but on the basis that if you believe that this is a human life, then there's no difference essentially between destroying that life for scientific research purposes or destroying the life of anyone here for the same purposes. Is that a misrepresentation of your argument?
Yeah, there are obvious differences between destroying an embryo that nobody's yet got to know and destroying people that we've formed friendships with and all the rest of it. So there are a whole lot of psychological differences, obviously. But when you're talking about the nature of this being, and it was interesting that Julian a minute ago was saying that these embryos already exist, so in terms of discriminating against them by destroying the ones with disabilities. But that's the view I would take. I was surprised he took it. So my view is that once an embryo comes into being, there's a new, unique human being there. I'm not saying it's a human being that has feelings or a human being that has yet a functioning brain, but it is a member of the human race. It is a member of our species. It is a member of the human family. And so to destroy it is to destroy a member of the human family.
What if the destruction of it, though, saves another member of the human family? Given that you've accepted now there is a difference between that life and the lives of people.
I'm not saying there's any difference in terms of intrinsic value. I'm saying there are differences, obviously, in terms of the humanity that's involved.
So you're saying there's no basis on which to privilege one kind of life?
Look, if you say, why don't we use embryos to produce cures and treatments and so on, why don't we use people who have dementia, or why don't we use people who are no longer conscious and so on? And the reason is because they're members of the human family. We don't treat the unresponsive people in that sort of a way.
Could it be that it's also because they have a social meaning attached to them that is different to that which is attached to an embryo, as you've said?
There's a difference in that they've got past relationships, and then there are people around them who still care for them. And so yes, there are differences in a social sense, but it doesn't change the nature of who they are as persons. They are still living members of the human family, just as the embryo is a living member of the human family.
Julian, does it matter whether or not we categorise them as human beings at that point?
Well, they're clearly human beings in the sense that they're members of the species, but I think none of us, but very few people in today's society accept Nick's view because they use contraception that destroys early embryos. They use the IED, they have abortions, they use IVF. All of these practices result in predictable loss. In fact, I think there's 100,000 abortions in Australia each year. We have laws requiring the destruction of embryos, and we don't have laws requiring the killing of innocent human beings. And that just shows that the embryo, if it is a human being, is a different kind of human being, and it doesn't have the moral status of a person. Well, it's not just that it doesn't have friends, it doesn't have the moral status of it.
Well, it shows that that's the way we approach it. It doesn't necessarily show that that's not something that could be rethought, though, does it?
Well, of course, you could rethink it, but you have to have a philosophical basis for it. And what is the reason that you think that it should be? Well, it's just that it happens to have the same number of chromosomes as us. It happens to belong to the same species. But why is that something that's intrinsically morally significant? You have to, I think, point to some feature that grounds a special kind of respect. And at that point, it's a group of cells that grow in a certain kind of way, but there's no element of consciousness. There's no ability to interact with other human beings or have anything but the most rudimentary biological existence. You can't tell the difference between a pig embryo and a human embryo in the way it behaves.
When Gab's in the laboratory with a human embryo in front of him, he knows he's not dealing with a pig embryo. He knows he's dealing with an embryo that has the chance to develop as that child, that much wanted child. He knows that within that little embryo is the complete capacity all the information required to develop rationality and all the things we value.
In every one of your skin cells there's a complete code
No, there isn't, because there isn't the capacity for embryogenesis.
But, the point we have to realise that obviously we're discussing about when life begins, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but we're talking about it, at best it's a potential fetus. The majority of embryos we produce, in the very best blastocysts, which have grown to 5 days, look good under the microscope, only 1 in 3 will implant. So we can't call them human beings. At best, they're potential embryos who might then go on to become a fetus and a human being. So I think they're a long way away from a human. Can I just say one thing? I think we're sort of running out of time, and it's really uncanny because it's 30 years ago in April 1981, I'd made my television debut on the Peter Couchman Show. And there was Peter Singer sitting in your chair, and Carl would ask me to go on last minute because he was busy. And that was just after the weekend they first spoke about freezing embryos on the ABC on the Science Show. So for all of a sudden, people thought, well, IVF might be dangerous, and we had this sort of general discussion: when does life begin? And here we are, 30 years later on, we still haven't worked out when life begins, but we still agree to disagree on a lot of the things.
Because it's a question I was going to ask, and I suppose in a way it's a yes-no question, although I suspect that's not the answer I'll get here. Is there a way to determine when a human being comes into existence that is not ultimately a religious or some other metaphysical question?
Well, it's very easy. The Jewish people have worked it out. Life for a Jewish mother begins when her son enters medical school.
Right.
Yeah, look, I think you have to ask yourself what really matters in life. And, we've invented this criterion of brain death. We've decided that when people's brains cease to function, that they're now technically dead. In fact, we withdraw life-sustaining treatment from people who are not brain dead but permanently unconscious. That is, we say that their life in an important sense stopped when they stopped being conscious. Well, if you think that what's important is consciousness, then you've got to look at the point where consciousness begins, which isn't until about 20 weeks into gestation. And that's just bare consciousness.
But you accept this is more or less an arbitrary distinction, or is there something absolute and real that we can point to?
We have to, in all of these cases, ask what's our fundamental value? What's the common currency that we can share? All of us can share the common currency of consciousness. When you come to other claims about value, you're starting to look at what minorities value. So it seems to me that the most uncontroversial view is something to do with consciousness.
Final words, Ian?
Well, just on the brain death thing, brain death is not about consciousness. Brain death is about loss of integration of the body. We haven't defined it in terms of consciousness, at least not here. Perhaps they have in the UK, but they haven't here. But in terms of this issue, of course I have to say that this is a matter of metaphysics. It is a matter of the way in which we regard human beings. But the position that I take is that every human being is important, no matter their disability, no matter what stage of life they're at, and that the stage of life that an embryo is at, or the stage of life that an unconscious person is at, a person in an unresponsive state is at, is still part of this existence, part of this life. And so that all human beings are important. All human beings are worthy of our respect and worthy of our love.